Clara's voice, you see, it wasn't just a sound. It was a weather system. When she stood up in the Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church on Sunday morning and let loose with a verse of "Wade in the Water," the air got thick and humid, like a summer afternoon right before a thunderstorm. And when she hit that high, pure note, the sun broke through the church windows, shining down on the dusty pine floors, and you just knew that whatever burdens you toted in your soul, they were going to feel a little lighter by the time you walked back out. She was the pride of Harmony Creek, our little town, and people came from 3 counties over just to hear that sound. Clara, she smiled easily, lived simply, and loved 2 things fiercely: her God and her boy, David. David was 6 years old and had his mother's wide, bright eyes, and every time Clara sang, David would sit right up front in the pew, his little hands clapping on the offbeat, his face shining with the reflected glory of her powerful song. Everything in Clara's world was tuned to that perfect, harmonious pitch. She sang at weddings, at baptisms, and she sang every evening while she cooked supper. A low, sweet humming that settled the nerves of her husband, Sam, after a hard day in the fields. She was the melody, and Harmony Creek was her choir. That voice was a gift, a promise, a river that never ran dry. But a river, even a strong one, can suddenly change its course, and sometimes a gift is only borrowed for a season. And Clara was about to learn that the hardest music of all is the one you can't hear. The day David went down to the creek, the same creek the town was named for, it was a Tuesday, hot as a griddle top. Sam had warned him, "Stay out the deeper parts, son, you hear?" But a boy's ears are often full of the noise of the water and the rustle of the woods, and they don't always catch a father's caution. Clara was in the kitchen, making peach cobbler, and she was humming that old hymn, "Sweet Hour of Prayer," but she wasn't singing it out loud, just a low, contented drone, because she knew David was nearby, chasing minnows. When the humming stopped, it wasn't because she was out of breath or had forgotten the words. The humming stopped because a cold, sudden silence, a silence colder than the well water, slipped under the door and wrapped itself around her heart. She dropped the flour sack. The white powder drifted down, slow and quiet, like snow in July. She ran. She ran toward the creek, her cotton dress slapping against her knees, her lungs already burning from an unvoiced scream. She saw Sam first, standing on the bank, his shoulders bowed like an old oak struck by lightning, just staring at the muddy water where the sun didn't touch the bottom. They buried David on a Saturday, underneath a weeping willow, and the whole town of Harmony Creek gathered. Reverend Elias spoke beautiful words about faith and acceptance, words that sounded like fine china shattering in the face of a true disaster. Clara, she stood there, dry-eyed, a stone woman wrapped in black muslin. People kept nudging her, murmuring, "Clara, honey, if you could just sing for him. One verse. Let your song comfort us." They needed her voice. They needed the weather system to change back, to wash away the mud and the sorrow. But when she opened her mouth, that big, glorious instrument that had filled auditoriums and healed broken souls, only air came out. Not a note, not a hum, not even a ragged whisper. The sound was gone. It had simply evaporated, stolen by the creek, leaving behind a hollow chamber where a cathedral of sound used to live. The silence she had felt in the kitchen had found a permanent home in her throat. Sam, he put his hand on her back, his own face a mask of grief, and he whispered, "It's all right, baby. We'll get it back. It's just shock." But Clara knew. This wasn't shock. This was payment. Her song had been too loud, her joy too bright, and the creek, or something older and deeper than the creek, had come to balance the scales. The following weeks were a slow-motion catastrophe inside their little farmhouse. Sam tried to fill the void with noise. The radio turned up loud, the clang of tools, the forced cheer of neighborly visits. But Clara moved through the house like a ghost tied to a mooring line. She couldn't speak, she couldn't hum, and the music that used to live inside her, a constant, joyful orchestra, was replaced by a roaring emptiness. It was worse than just not having a voice. It was like having a secret, powerful engine inside her that was running without gasoline, just grinding and burning itself out. When Sam asked her a question, she wrote the answer on a little chalkboard he'd hung by the fireplace, her handwriting neat and impersonal. She wouldn't look him in the eye. That loss of voice became a wall between them, thicker than any stone. Sam needed to hear her voice to believe the loss was real, to hear her cry and let the pain out. But Clara, she felt the pain too deeply to give it sound. It had settled deep in her bones, a heavy, unmoving tide. He'd plead, "Clara, just one word. Tell me what you need." And she would just shake her head, point to the board and write, "Quiet." The townsfolk whispered, of course. They said the Lord had taken her gift because she loved David more than the giver. They said the devil had sealed her lips. But Clara knew the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. She had stopped singing because the world, without David's little hands clapping, didn't deserve a song.
But memories replay every night. Can't erase you, try as I might. Faded photographs in boxes, still holding on when the world moves on. You said forever, but nothing lasts. Echoes of us in a quiet.
The silence began to acquire a personality. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a presence. It followed her around the house, a cool, invisible hand resting on the back of her neck. When she sat alone in the rocking chair, staring out at the dusty yard, the silence would lean in, whispering without words. It told her things she already knew, that she should have kept David closer, that the peach cobbler could have waited, that the humming was too selfish. It was a torment, quiet and constant, and it was driving a wedge between Clara and the last bit of light she had left, which was Sam. Sam, bless his heart, he was rough and simple, and he couldn't understand a torment without a noise. He saw her silence as rejection, as a judgment against his own grief. He'd shout, his voice cracking with frustration, "Clara, you gotta talk to me. We lost him together. Don't shut me out." And the silence would smile, a cold, toothless grin, knowing it had won another round. Clara tried to hug Sam, tried to communicate the crushing love and guilt through her touch, but Sam would pull away, needing that sound, that assurance that the woman he married, the songbird of Harmony Creek, hadn't completely vanished into the ether. He didn't want the comfort of her hand. He wanted the miracle of her voice, and she couldn't give it to him, not a single syllable. Martha Bell, the church organist and the town's chief gossiper, came calling with a dish of collard greens and a heart full of pointed questions. Martha had always been jealous of Clara's voice. Clara knew it, Martha knew it, and the Lord certainly knew it. Martha sat herself down on Clara's best parlor sofa and watched Clara meticulously wipe a spot off the chalkboard. "Now, Clara, honey," Martha began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You know the Bible says, 'Make a joyful noise unto the Lord.' You ain't making no noise at all. The choir's falling apart without you. Folks are starting to wonder if your heart's still with the Lord, or if maybe you lost your faith right there by the creek." The words were designed to wound, and they landed straight in the marrow. Clara's hands clenched, but she couldn't respond. She just kept wiping the invisible spot on the board, a furious focus that kept the scream trapped behind the silent door in her throat. Martha mistook her restraint for defeat. "Reverend Elias is talking." One night, Clara was jolted awake not by a sound, but by a sound's opposite. She sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering against her ribs. The house was quiet, the air still and heavy, but the silence was different. It wasn't just a heavy blanket. It was a pathway. In the deep, absolute quiet, Clara started to hear things that weren't there. Not voices, not melodies, but sensations translated into a rhythm. The grinding of the river stones deep beneath the creek's current, the slow, unseen crawl of earthworms under the roots of the willow, the gentle, forgotten sigh of the earth itself. It was the subconscious of the world, and it was terrifyingly loud. She put her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The sound without sound was coming from inside the shell of her head, beating like a desperate drum. And mixed into that overwhelming hum of existence, she heard him. Not David's voice, but David's presence. A faint, tiny echo of his laughter. The splash of his hand against water. the simple, honest joy he'd felt right before. The memory sound was tied irrevocably to the creek. It was a siren, pulling her back to the source of her pain. She slid out of bed, leaving Sam sleeping heavily, smelling of exhaustion and cheap whiskey, and she knew then that her healing, or her final unraveling, wouldn't be found in a church pew or a choir hymn. It would be found in the mud and the water, where the song ended and the silence began its strange, terrible lesson. The next morning, Sam found the chalkboard leaning against the back door, scrawled in Clara's usual neat hand, but with a frantic, sharp energy, was one word: creek. He stared at it, bewildered, then ran through the house. She was gone. Her travel bag, packed with a clean dress and a tin of biscuits, was missing from the closet shelf. Sam went cold all over, a deeper cold than the morning dew. He knew she hadn't run away from him. She had run to the silence. He drove his old Ford pickup down the dusty road that led to the woods, his mind reeling. He remembered the old stories, the folktales that the elders used to tell, about the creek being a hungry thing, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. He'd always dismissed them as nonsense, the fanciful worries of God-fearing people. But now, with Clara gone and only the echo of her lost voice in his heart, he started to believe. He believed that the creek had taken David, and now it was pulling Clara back to finish the job. He didn't know what he would say or do when he found her. If he found her, how do you pull a woman back from the one place that holds the last ghost of the only thing she truly loved? And what if she didn't want to come back? The fear was a physical weight, pressing down on the accelerator, making his foot tremble as he sped toward the treacherous, silent bank. Clara walked deep into the woods, following the sound without sound that had guided her from the farmhouse. The woods were thick, smelling of pine needle decay and damp earth. She hadn't been this deep since David's passing. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig underfoot, felt like a judgment. The air here was different. It didn't just lack sound. It absorbed it, a heavy, woolen cloak that muffled even the buzz of insects. She reached the creek. It looked innocent enough, a sluggish, brown ribbon of water winding between the moss-covered stones. But Clara knew its deceit. She knelt at the exact spot where David was last seen, the stones cold and slick against her fingertips. She closed her eyes. The physical silence outside was absolute, but the internal roar, the collective, constant hum of the world, was deafening now. She focused on the echo of David. It was stronger here. She could almost feel the weight of his small body, the frantic, final struggle. She wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice of the water, but the silence held her captive. She realized the silence wasn't just a punishment. It was a mirror. It was reflecting all the unspoken grief, the unacknowledged guilt, the raw, ugly truth that she had kept locked away. Her voice had been too loud to hear the truth, and now the enforced quiet was forcing her to listen. She spent the night by the creek, wrapped in a thin blanket. The moon was a sliver of bone, barely penetrating the canopy. She had a vision, or maybe just a memory given a cruel shape by the dark. She saw David standing in the water, his back to her, and he wasn't calling out. He was humming. It was her hymn, Sweet Hour of Prayer, the low, contented drone she had been making that Tuesday. David turned his head, his face serene, and he pointed down into the water. In the vision, Clara tried to run to him, but her feet were shackled to the stones. She tried to scream, but the air was solid in her throat. That's when she understood the conflict. Her voice hadn't been taken by God or the devil. It was taken by the memory of her humming, of her contentment, of the moment she wasn't watching. The silence was David's final lullaby, a sound meant only for her, a sound that wouldn't let any other music enter or escape. It was a selfish, all-consuming love. When morning broke, she found a single, smooth, white river stone nestled near her hand, placed on a dark patch of mud. It was cold, pure, and out of place. She picked it up and held it. It was like holding a concentrated piece of the creek's silence. Sam reached the creek just as the sun was burning the mist off the water. He saw her immediately, sitting motionless on the bank, wearing the same dark dress she'd worn to the funeral. He didn't call out. The atmosphere was too fragile, too charged. He walked slowly, his boots crunching on the dry leaves, each step a violation of the sacred quiet. Clara looked up, and for the first time in months, her eyes held something other than deep emptiness. They held a strange, unsettling clarity. She didn't look happy to see him, but she didn't look angry either. She looked resolved. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse from fear and the long drive. "Clara, come home, please. We need to talk." She shook her head slightly, then reached for the chalkboard. She wrote, "I am talking." Sam frowned, frustrated. "No, you ain't. You're writing. I need to hear your voice, Clara. I need to know you're still in there." Clara lifted the stone she'd found. It was bone white and smooth. She tapped the stone gently against the chalkboard. Tap, 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 tap. It wasn't writing. It was rhythm. She tapped out a complex beat, a syncopated, quiet drum solo that spoke volumes. It was the frantic beat of her own heart, the rhythmic flow of the water, and the ghostly pulse of David's life. Sam stared, horrified. His wife was communicating, but not with words or music. She was communicating with the language of the dead and the natural world. Martha Bell, still determined to reclaim her spot in the church hierarchy, rallied a small group of church ladies and drove to the creek. She brought a picnic basket full of chicken and a heart full of judgment. She found Sam trying, clumsily, to coax Clara home. Martha took one look at Clara, tapping that silent stone, and sniffed with righteous disgust. "Sam," she announced, "you gotta bring her back. She's gone wild, sitting out here talking to the river stones. This ain't grief, honey. This is a rejection of the grace of God. She needs an exorcism or maybe just a good, firm hand." Clara looked up at Martha, her eyes flat and cold. She raised the stone and tapped it once, sharply, on the ground. "Stop." Martha, unnerved by the intensity of the silent glare, faltered. Sam finally erupted, the pressure of months of grief and frustration boiling over. "You leave her alone, Martha. You got no business coming out here judging a soul. You got your church, you got your choir, you got your perfect little life. Let us be." He was shouting, the sound tearing through the woods. The silence, which had been cooperating with Clara, suddenly shifted. It didn't appreciate the noise. A cold draft swept over them, and the creek water, usually placid, churned just enough to throw a handful of muddy spray onto Martha Bell's pristine white blouse. Martha shrieked and scrambled back, convinced she'd been cursed. The conflict had brought the creek to life. Clara refused to leave the creek. Sam compromised, pitching a small canvas tent nearby. He stayed with her, watching her, unable to touch her, feeling like a sentry guarding a crumbling ruin. He started to watch how she moved. She wasn't silent in the way he thought. She was simply expressing herself in a different, more ancient language. She would point to the way the moss grew on a certain tree to tell him about the direction of the wind. She'd rearranged the stones to signal the time of day. She was living completely in the moment, tethered only to the natural, cyclical world. Sam, a practical man of the fields, found himself watching a woman transformed into a pagan priestess, a living instrument of the earth. He became protective of her silence. When a hiker stumbled upon their makeshift camp, Sam chased him off with a look. He knew that the moment Clara was pulled back into the world of human sound, the gossip, the hymns, the casual talk, the spell would be broken, and the deeper, secret song she was searching for would vanish. He was starting to believe that the silence held David, not as a ghost, but as a pure, unfiltered memory that could only exist without the interference of human language. He saw the stone in her hand, the smooth, white one, and he watched as she began to polish it gently with the hem of her dress, day after day. The inner world Clara was accessing was getting clearer, deeper, and more compelling. The sound without sound was no longer just the hum of the earth. It was a rhythmic, pulsing narrative, a story told in the universal language of vibration. She realized that the creek was not just the place David died. It was where David's energy was absorbed and stored, and the silence was the key to retrieving it. Her subconscious, free from the dictation of her powerful voice, was blossoming. She started drawing images in the dirt with a stick, not just simple pictures, but complex geometric patterns, symbols that felt thousands of years old. One day, she drew a perfect circle, and inside it, a smaller circle with a splash mark at the center. It was a map of the creek showing the precise eddy, the deep current that took David. She pointed to the spot on the Rayal Creek bank, and Sam, curious, grabbed a shovel and started digging into the muddy earth. Clara stood over him, tapping her stone slowly, urging him on. He dug until the shovel struck something hard. Not a stone, but something manufactured, something that didn't belong in the earth. Sam pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket, the kind that held 2 tiny photographs. It was David's locket, a gift from his grandmother, a locket that had been missing since the funeral. When they opened it, one side held a picture of Clara, smiling in her younger days, and the other side held a picture of David, his bright 6-year-old face beaming. But what truly mattered was the feel of the locket. It was cold, heavy, and wet, a piece of David's life that the creek had kept, a piece of his final moments. Clara took the locket, holding it up to the light. The sun caught the tarnished silver, and for a second, she saw David's face reflected perfectly in the metal. It was a tangible connection, something the silence couldn't steal. She turned to Sam, tears finally, freely streaming down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release. The memory, contained within the stone and the locket, was finally ready to be processed. Sam reached for her, and this time she didn't flinch away. She leaned into him, her body shaking, and the cold hand of the silence on her neck finally, gently, lifted. But the silence in her throat remained. The grief was released, but the voice was still locked away. Sam, feeling the brief flicker of their connection return, pleaded with her one last time. "Clara, please, it's time to come home. Reverend Elias has found that woman, Ruby. She's singing this Sunday. She's singing your songs. Don't let her take your place." The mention of Ruby struck a chord of fierce jealousy and indignation in Clara. Her voice was her inheritance, her identity, and the idea of a usurper singing her testimony galvanized her. It wasn't about the congregation. It was about the territory of her soul. She picked up the chalkboard and, with shaking fingers, wrote one clear, defiant sentence. "She will not." Sam's heart leaped. That was the first true act of will he'd seen from her since David's passing. He packed up the tent immediately. He understood the unspoken challenge. The silence had taught her how to fight, and now she was ready to fight the world that had cast her out. She was returning to Harmony Creek, not as a victim, but as a silent warrior coming to reclaim her throne. They drove back into town late on a Saturday night. Harmony Creek was quiet, the houses dark, waiting for the Sunday morning spectacle. Clara went straight to the church. The doors were unlocked, the massive, dusty sanctuary empty. She walked to the front, stepped up into the choir stand, and stood on the spot where she had always sung. It was covered with a sheet of canvas, waiting for the visiting singer, Ruby. Clara pulled the canvas off with a snap. The silence in the room was immense, heavier than any physical weight. She looked out at the empty pews where she used to see David's bright face. She closed her eyes. She wasn't trying to force the voice out. She was trying to force the silence to obey her. She raised her arms, the movement slow and deliberate, and she began to conduct. She conducted the hum of the fluorescent lights, the drip of the leaky faucet in the baptistry, the faint, high-pitched whine of the electricity running through the walls. She was conducting the world's noise without meaning, weaving it into a tapestry of complex, inner rhythm. She was rehearsing the song that only she could hear. The next morning, the church was packed. People had heard that the famous Ruby was singing, and they'd also heard the rumors that Clara was back. A broken Clara, a silent Clara. The air was thick with expectation and judgment. Ruby, a beautiful woman with a voice like polished mahogany, was introduced. She began to sing Clara's signature song, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand." She sang it perfectly, professionally, hitting every note with smooth, calculated power. But the song was empty. It was technically brilliant, but it lacked the hurricane, the weather system, the soul that Clara always poured into it. Martha Bell, sitting at the organ, watched Clara walk slowly down the aisle, the white river stone clutched in her hand. Clara didn't go to her old spot. She walked right up to the altar, stood directly in front of Ruby, and turned to face the congregation. Ruby stopped singing mid-verse, startled by Clara's sudden, silent presence. The church went absolutely quiet. This was the moment of confrontation. Ruby looked confused, Martha Bell looked triumphant, and Sam, in the back pew, held his breath. Clara looked out at the sea of faces, and her eyes settled on the empty spot where David used to clap. She lifted her hand, the hand holding the smooth, white stone. It was the heartbeat of the earth, the frantic pulse of life and death, the splash of the creek, and the hidden rhythm of the silence, all distilled into one solid, percussive sound. It was the music David had heard in his final moments, the sound that had become her constant torment. Clara was exorcising the memory by making it a public song. She moved her shoulders, her feet, her whole body flowing with the rhythm, silent, powerful, completely lost in the performance. The congregation was mesmerized. They weren't hearing music. They were hearing pure, raw emotion, rhythm without melody. It was the most honest sound anyone in Harmony Creek had ever heard. The rhythm grew more intense, demanding, pulling the energy from the heavy, expectant air. Clara slammed the stone down one final time, a single sharp crack that seemed to split the silence in two. And then she stopped. She stood perfectly still, breathing hard, the stone warm in her hand. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before. It wasn't empty, nor was it deafening. It was expectant, waiting. It was a silence that had fulfilled its purpose, a silence that had finally sung its truth. Ruby, the visiting singer, understood immediately. She backed away from the altar, humbled. Martha Bell looked deflated, her judgment replaced by sheer awe. Sam, tears running down his face, knew he was looking at his wife, truly seeing her for the first time in months. She had brought the creek to the church, and in doing so, she had bridged the gap between the living and the lost. She had transformed the absence of sound into a powerful, undeniable presence. Clara turned toward the choir stand. She didn't look at Ruby or Martha. She looked at the microphone, the cold, metallic instrument that had amplified her voice for so many years. She lifted her hand to the microphone, but she didn't touch it. She didn't open her mouth. She didn't try to sing. Instead, she took the white river stone, the stone that held the concentrated silence of the creek and the memory of David, and she placed it gently on the microphone stand. It was a silent, ritualistic transfer of power. She turned and walked out of the church, her head held high, leaving the stone as her replacement, her permanent testament to the music that is always present, even when you can't hear it. The town watched her go. No one moved to stop her. They all knew in that gut-level folktale way that they had just witnessed a miracle, not of sound but of silence. Clara returned to the farmhouse, but she was a different woman. She didn't write on the chalkboard anymore. She had found a new way to communicate. Sam would come home from the fields, and she would meet him at the door. She would tap a quick, affectionate rhythm on his chest, a secret, gentle beat that told him she loved him. If he was worried, she would tap a slow, steady pulse on the kitchen counter, grounding him in the simple stability of their life. The silence was still with her, but it wasn't a punishment anymore. It was a sanctuary, a quiet room in the back of her mind where the new song lived. She learned to cook supper in perfect, meditative quiet, listening to the sizzle of the fat and the low rumble of the refrigerator as her symphony. She realized that her voice had been so loud, so overwhelming, that it had forced her to sing only the songs the world wanted to hear. The silence was forcing her to listen to the song her soul was singing. One evening, Sam was sitting on the porch, strumming his old, beat-up guitar, trying to play a blues riff he couldn't quite master. He played a chord, then stopped, frustrated. Clara came out and sat beside him. Without a word, she reached out and plucked a single, low string on the guitar. Gong. Then a higher one. Ping. She started plucking random strings, but with a complex, perfect timing. It wasn't a melody, but the intervals and the rhythm worked together to create a hypnotic, ambient sound that was both haunting and healing. She wasn't singing, but she was making music. She was teaching Sam the language of the silence. She had found her creative synergy not in sound, but in the deliberate use of its absence, creating art that was more evocative and addictive than her gospel hymns had ever been. She had accessed a deeper, subconscious well of rhythm and feeling. Years passed. The little white river stone stayed on the microphone stand in the Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church, a silent, powerful monument. Ruby never came back. Martha Bell tried to use the organ again, but the congregation always felt the empty space where Clara's silent rhythm had lived. The church learned to love the sound of quiet. Clara and Sam grew old together in Harmony Creek, their lives woven together by the unspoken language of taps, touches, and deep, knowing glances.